forgot to do it again. So, but it is recording now. So, for those of you who missed Monday's stream, we discussed the beginnings of attitudinalism. So, what is attitudinalism? Where does it come from? What's the idea behind it, right? And basically, these things boil down to judges are legislators, and they are enacting their policy preferences when they make decisions. And so all of this stuff that judges do with creating these legal arguments is all just a mirage that's intended to convince you that they're not just doing whatever they want. And as I think we've learned over the course of the semester, what it really amounts to is that the story's more complicated than that. And the first issue that attitudinalism runs into is sort of what we're going to be talking about today. And that's measurement, right? Because in order for us to determine that judges are enacting their policy preferences, we have to figure out what those policy preferences are and how to measure what a judge's ideology really is. So you may be sort of sitting here going, well, I didn't sign up for a public opinion course. I'm here to learn about judges. And that's a fair comment. But basically, this is an important component here, right? So what we have is a number of different ways to approach how we measure judicial ideology. And none of them are perfect, right? I want to be very clear about this. None of them are perfect, and all of them are really focused on figuring out how we measure the ideology of Supreme Court justices. And the problem with that is, as I think I've emphasized sort of throughout the semester, the Supreme Court decides 80 to 100 cases a year, somewhere between 99 and 99.9999% of the federal docket takes place in other courts. And so if the only thing that we're really able to explain as political scientists is the way that Supreme Court justices behave, well, we really don't know much about the judicial system at all. So how do we measure the ideology of judges? Okay, how do we get here? How do we talk about this? Hi, Sergeant Peaches. I'm glad you're here. I'm live twice on Monday, Wednesday, Friday to teach my classes. Glad you came along. So the way that we measure judicial ideology has evolved over the years, right? We go back to the 1980s and the early 1990s, and we're seeing a couple of different ways, right? First of all, we see this movement to assign judges a partisan label. So judges that are appointed by Democratic presidents are Democratic judges. Judges that are appointed by Republican presidents are Republican judges. And the problem with that is that not every decision that judges make map onto this sort of Democrat-Republican divide. It's sometimes hard to see which side the the decision falls on. So then we get a little bit later in the 1980s, we see the development of some indexing scores. And one of the things that we try is we try to use newspapers to develop our ideological scores. So liberal newspapers that endorse justice nominations mean that the justice is more liberal, and conservative papers that endorse justice nominations means the justice is more conservative. And the problem with this is, first of all, newspapers don't give us a whole lot of information about what's actually in the justice's head, right? Because the newspaper editors aren't telling us, they don't have any special insight into what's in the justice's mind. And so we are assigning to the justice the policy preferences of a newspaper when that may not actually be what's going on. And then the second issue with that is, well, the way that the justice was when they were nominated isn't necessarily how they're going to be over the course of their entire career, right? So we can talk about examples of John Paul Stevens or David Souter or Anthony Kennedy, all of whom were nominated by Republican presidents as conservative justices, and over the course of their careers became recognized as more liberal justices over the course of decades. And you can argue over whether the justices moved or whether the court moved. That's a whole different issue. But the newspapers that were endorsing them when they were nominated weren't necessarily supporting them over the entire course of their career. And so the development of a measure that captures judicial ideology over time becomes a really important component here, right? And so we start to see some development with what's called Martin Quinn scores. And Martin Quinn scores, and they're named after the scholars who developed them, who are really just brilliant people. But the problem with Martin Quinn scores is that they use the votes of the justice to measure the ideology of the justice. Okay? So if you've taken 202 or a research methods course, you may be starting to be a little suspicious right now, because you may be thinking that this is an endogenous measurement where the thing that we are measuring is being used to create the measurement. You would be correct. Okay, and the best answer that I've gotten from people sort of defending the Martin Quinn scores is, well, they work, they give us results that we're expecting, and we don't have anything better. We don't have anything better is a valid response, right? That's reasonable, but it doesn't mean that we have results that we can trust, right? And so we're left going, what can we do? How can we measure this? And a couple of later developments help sort of give us some better measures. The first is the development of the judicial common space. Okay, the judicial common space is developed in the late 1990s by a group of professors who are at Wash U at the time. One of them is Andrew Martin of the Martin Quinn scores, and he's now at Michigan. One is Lee Epstein, who is bouncing back and forth between Northwestern and Wash U. I'm not sure where she is right now, but she keeps going back and forth between those two places. And the judicial common space comes up with this really ingenious argument for imputing ideological measures. Okay, so what we mean by imputing ideological measures means that we are taking an ideological measure for one person and we are assigning that ideological measure to the judge. We know it's not the judge's ideological measure, but we are treating it as if it is because it logically makes sense. Let me tell you how the judicial common space works. Federal judges are appointed by the president and with the advice and consent of the Senate, and lower court judges, not Supreme Court justices, but lower court judges, home state senators are consulted. So judges from Alabama have the senators from Alabama consulted, judges from California have the senators from California consulted, and so on and so on and so on. Where the senators are not from the same party as the president, we expect there to be, and we observe there to be, a moderating influence. So when senators are from the same party as the president, judges from that state tend to be more extreme. And when the senators and the president are from different parties, judges are more moderate. Okay, so what does that mean for us? We have an ideological measure for the president and for Congress. It's called the DW Nominate Scores, and you don't have to know anything more about it other than this is what it is, this is what it's called. Okay? DW Nominate Scores allow us to measure the ideology of legislators and executives. And so what we did, what Epstein and Martin and their co-authors did, was they said, what if we took the mean of the nominate scores for the home state senators and the president, and we assigned that mean to the judge? What would that get us in terms of predicting judicial behavior? And what they found was that it provided a pretty good result. Okay? So the theory is that there's some sort of connection between the ideological measure that we use for the Senate and for the president and the judges that come out of that selection process. What that mechanism is has never really been specified. I want to be very clear about this. The judicial common space is right now the gold standard in judicial ideology because it works, because it gives us results that match up with our expectations. Okay? But we don't know why it works. We don't understand how these ideological scores for people who aren't involved in judicial decision making can predict judicial decision making. Okay? If we're being very honest, this is what is sometimes referred to as barefoot empiricism. Sergeant, this is a great question, and I'm going to answer it in about 30 seconds. So Sergeant Peaches asks, do you think it will change in the future away from the judicial common space? And the answer is yes. Here's what's happening. There's a new data set that's come out. And I can remember the acronym, and I can't remember what it stands for. I always just call it the DIME-CF data set. But the DIME-CF data set is a ideological score that is based on campaign contributions. Campaign contributions. Now, how do we deal with the fact that an awful lot of judges, because they want to be apolitical, don't engage in making campaign contributions? Here's how the DIME-CF authors dealt with this. Judges hire law clerks. Supreme Court justices hire 4 law clerks a year. Court of Appeals judges hire, I think also 4. District court judges hire 3 every year, right? Or every 2 years. They're constant churn of law clerks. These law clerks come in, they work a year or 2 in the courthouse, and then they go out the door. And so the argument is that these law clerks share ideological values with the judges. They share policy preferences with judges. And so we can develop ideological scores for the judges based on the pattern of campaign contributions that we see from their clerks. So, does this make sense so far? I don't care whether it does or it doesn't. I'm moving on. So, the DIME-CF scores are intended to give us a way to measure the ideology of the judges by looking at their campaign contributions and the campaign contributions of their former clerks. And that is how we develop those scores. Now, I can tell you, because my research uses both measures as a robustness check, we don't see a lot of difference in the results between the two. For the most part, the patterns of behavior hold regardless of which ideological measure you use. But the DIME-CF measure is actually grounded in the behavior of people in the courthouse, whereas the judicial common space is based on ideological preferences of senators and the president, who aren't involved in any case, right? So the argument is that the DIME-CF scores are theoretically better grounded to actually capture the ideological decision-making of the ideological preferences of the people who are doing the judicial decision-making. You can buy it. Maybe you don't. Maybe you think the judicial common space gives us a handle on how judges make decisions based on how they're selected. I think that's a reasonable argument. So I think that there's ways to approach both of these. Okay? So the key component here is that none of these give us a real handle on how judges think they're making their decisions, what's going on in their minds, right? Because judges don't think that they're behaving ideologically. Judges think that they're really interested in getting the case right. And so starting on Monday, we're going to talk about a different approach to judicial decision making that's built around the argument that law matters and that there is some sort of constraint that is exercised on judicial decision making by the law. We'll talk about the evidence for that and sort of what is out there one way or the other on Monday. But for today, I really want to drive home the notion that as political scientists, we presume that judges are focused on this policy preference idea, that they really want to reach outcomes that they prefer. And one of the things that I think is really important for us to keep in mind is to ask, do judges think that that's what they're doing? And if not, why do we insist that they're wrong? Okay? So, with all of that said, I'll look forward to seeing you guys on Monday, and we will take up the legal model then. So, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.